Good morning. It is Thursday. We have concluded kind of reviewing and looking at the Punic Wars, which was really the first big and epic series of wars that Rome had to become the empire they became. Today, we're going to actually look at Julius Caesar, who's going to become Rome's first emperor. I know, you're like, huh? Emperor. We've had some. Actually, no, we've had dictators who kind of were like emperors, but Caesar is going to become the actual first full-blown declared emperor king, if you will, who will have his own son, well, step nephew. It's kind of complicated, confusing, but yes. So, yesterday and Tuesday, we were looking at some cool stuff, looking deeper into the Punic Wars, and that was really only scratching the surface of that. When I said earlier this year that we could literally spend an entire year learning about just one of this many civilizations we've talked about, this is what I mean. There's so much history, it's crazy. But here's what we're going to do the last 2 days of this week. First, today, like I just said, we're going to talk about Julius Caesar and kind of how he rose to power and what was happening a couple years after the Punic Wars, about over a course of 50 to 150 years after the Punic Wars. Then tomorrow, we're going to look at that nephew, son. Yeah, it's confusing and complicated. His name's going to be Octavian, and he's going to take on a famous name, which kind of resembles a month. Maybe for a reason. We'll see. And next week, we're going to end up doing some fun stuff where we'll actually I think I mentioned it last week, but next week for sure, I was looking at these notes here, and it's kind of complicated and a lot. So we're going to look at Roman life and society and how the Romans lived. And we're actually going to kind of break that off and do some group stuff. So probably on Monday, we'll have a Zoom meeting, most likely Tuesday and Wednesday as well. And the way it's going to look is I'm going to have you all break off into groups, and you'll take notes and begin making some presentations that will then share out to the rest of the 6th grade. Ooh. So let's get to it. So section 2, Rome becomes an empire. Write this down, or you could type these notes. Either one is fine. Just remember, writing's probably the easiest. And once we have finished this, make sure you take a picture of your notes and attach it and turn it in onto this assignment. Just a reminder about that, by the way. If you don't have Google Classroom on your phone, get it on your phone. It makes it much easier to take a picture and then upload that to Google Classroom. All right, here we go. So Rome becoming an empire. So the first thing is we're going to have conflicts at home after the Punic Wars. And part of the problem we see post-Punic Wars, if you remember, there's lots of new slaves. The rich got even richer, and the poor got even poorer. If you remember, all that land that Carthage owned was kind of given to the wealthy. So we're going to kind of see that they don't really care so much about the government because they have a lot of power. And the rich are really the only ones who can be elected anyways. So yeah, there's some irony there. Some of them really don't care, and they're the very ones that can run the government. The reason why is because they are more focused on making more and more money. If you just got a bunch of land and there's a bunch of slaves ready to buy, 2 and 2 together, land gives you more money. When you have slaves, you're not paying people, so you're making even more money. So that's all they're really focusing on, is turning this land they got into making money. And naturally, you're going to see a rise of more upset poor people, more protests, because you have all these new slaves who are literally taking jobs from the poor and doing it for free. So the whole idea of jobs and money is nothing new. This has been a problem for centuries, even all the way back to Rome. So reform is going to fail. These poor people who are upset actually pushed for reform to try and get rid of this, try to fix it, try and make it normal. What was the point of it? Really, to break up these large land estates. What a land estate is, it's just a large amount of land that someone owns So all through history, when we've talked about people owning land, remember all year long, a lot of people have been thinking the idea is like, oh, my grandfather owns land, or oh, my family owns some land down by Farmington. Not like that. It may be that much land, but more importantly, there's people that then live on that land, farm on that land, and you make a ton of money from that land. So yes, you could sell land you own and make a lot of money potentially, but we're talking about land that is making tons and tons of money for these people. That's the difference. And really, what ended up happening, Rome is full of a lot of assassination and betrayal and intrigue and all this craziness. A lot of these very wealthy landowners, who were often also senators, had a lot of these reformers killed, which ended our reform. Rip. All right, that being said, here, I'm going to keep moving on. Go ahead and pause if you're still writing, but I'm moving on. Alrighty. So Civil War is going to break out because of this, because why not? And with our Civil War, it's really over the unequal wealth that exists in Rome. And really, the reason why I said last week plebeians and patricians are going to be important to remember. Remember, our plebeians are the everyone else, whereas your patricians are your very wealthy Romans. So really, it's rich versus poor is what the Civil Wars broke out between. And if you remember back to the Punic Wars, a lot of the soldiers were plebeians. Now, just because someone's a plebeian doesn't mean like they're homeless and they're poor like that. It just means in comparison to our patricians, who are often our senators, our generals, they're normal people to poor people. And normal people, there is no middle class. That doesn't exist in Rome. So there's artisans who maybe make a good living and they survive and they're not dying, but they're not as rich as patricians. So poor are often soldiers. A lot of the men get drafted to become soldiers of Rome, or Rome was unique in the fact that soldiers was a profession and you got paid pretty well actually. So a lot of our plebeians who are soldiers often are going to be loyal and follow their generals. So if you look back to the Punic Wars, think of Scipio Africanus. He was the guy who basically helped win the war. People were going to be loyal to him, especially when they were a really good leader. So in this era, we're going to see a patrician and senator named Marius, which he's basically going to lead the half of the Civil War that the plebeians or the poor people support. And on the opposite side is Sulla, who was a general fighting for the side of the rich, if you will. Now, both of these men had plebeians fighting for them. That's their former soldiers that were just really loyal to them. Even though those soldiers may have been fighting against their interests because they're fighting for the rich, it's almost kind of like Democrats or Republicans. Both sides are led by very wealthy people, and both sides have a lot of poor people, or average people, if you will, today, who support both sides. So that's kind of the idea to think about. So I know someone's thinking, well, why would poor people want to support the rich? For that same reason, it's normal. Why would you want to change what is normal? So in the end, Sulla on the wealthy side, they're going to win. And he's going to become the dictator of Rome. And I'm going to move on. So pause here if you're still writing. But I am moving on. And so a couple years later, Sulla is going to die. He's not going to be killed. I don't believe he was killed. I think he just was older and he dies. So after his rule, there's a man named Julius Caesar who's going to rise to fame. And Julius Caesar was a general, politician, and then later, very soon here, a dictator. And Julius Caesar was again a patrician. He was from a wealthy family. His family of which had kind of, it was a very wealthy family, and it was kind of not as wealthy as it once was. And he is going to be the person who changes that, actually. And the family he was born into was actually a very old family of Rome. It was an old noble family. So You're talking about going back to the Punic Wars. Julius Caesar had some ancestors who fought in those Punic Wars. And I think it was like his great-grandfather fought in the Punic Wars. So he has a older family that is known. People know who he is or know of his name. And he actually was a brilliant general. He was a brilliant general. Now, again, I abbreviated general as like a military general. And he's actually going to see a lot of success in war. And the map that we're talking about would be this here map. So Julius Caesar. Let me pull up that map for you real quick. Julius Caesar map. Gaul. And he's going to end up conquering most of what is today France. But back then they called it Gaul. Now, if you kind of remember back to our Punic Wars, Gaul were the very people that Carthage recruited to help fight. And in some regards, some of these people also supported Rome in those wars. And ultimately, Caesar's going to become a dictator for life here shortly. So, Battle of Gaul map. Julius Caesar. Gaul. So ultimately, Julius Caesar is going to end up being the main reason why Rome conquers France. So here's kind of a blurry map for you, but if you look at it, he left Rome here early on, about 58 BC, and he's essentially just going to march around Gaul, conquering all of this for Rome. And here's another map for you to kind of show. So after our Pontic Wars, Rome had expanded all into the Mediterranean. And here in green is what Julius Caesar is going to go on to conquer. And eventually, he's going to start pushing for Great Britain, well, what will be known as England, but not yet. And actually, this is by the time Julius Caesar dies, this is how big Rome will become. So yeah. All right, so Caesar is going to become a dictator for life. Interesting. He was really, really famous amongst the commoners, the poor people of Rome. Remember, he's a general, so part of it is his own soldiers, but not every single person of Rome was a soldier. So you had people who actually like Julius Caesar. And the main reason why was he was one of the few patricians who actually wanted to reform. He wanted change. He wanted to modernize Rome. He wanted to make more equal rights, if you will. And because of that, Caesar's going to make some very famous enemies because of his crazy ideas, or at least what his enemies said were crazy. And Cicero was his #1 enemy. This is going to be like his biggest rival. Go ahead and pause here if you need to keep writing. I'm moving on though. And ultimately, the Senate was afraid because remember, Julius Caesar had just conquered France or Gaul, and he has this really big army, and he wants to see changes in Rome. He's not the dictator yet. He's still just a general. So they wanted to take his army away because, well, think of it. If you have a big army and a lot of people really like you and you're really famous, what are you probably going to do with that army? Yep. You're going to take over Rome, and that's exactly what he did. So the Senate tried to take him out of the command, to try and get rid of his army. That didn't work. He instead marched to Rome. And because of this, a civil war is going to break out between Caesar and the Republic, the Roman Republic. So much like if you remember back to Cincinnatus last week, the Roman Republic, the Senate, called on some former generals to fight against Caesar because they saw him as a threat. But Caesar, because again, was a brilliant general, he's going to win this civil war. and become the dictator of Rome. So as dictator, what is Julius Caesar going to do? Well, first thing he does is declare himself the absolute ruler. If you remember, when we talked about monarchy, they are known as an absolute ruler. So he basically named himself the dictator king of Rome. Ultimately, as an absolute ruler, you rule absolutely. Everything you say is done. So it means the ruler, the king, is in charge. Also, Caesar's going to expand the amount of people who could be in the Senate. So more of his supporters could be elected. So more people who will support decisions he wants to make. And he's going to make himself the king of Rome. And because he's becoming a king, much like in a monarchy, after he dies, his family will rule after him. That is his choice. And this is going to really, really, really upset a ton of senators of Rome. Because you got to remember, Rome is a republic. Much like the founding of the United States, we were against founding a kingdom or having a king. Same with Rome. In our oldest history of Rome, kings just fought each other and it wasn't good. So the Senate was eventually created and it was much better. Go ahead and pause here if you're still writing. And I'm moving on. So, as a result, Julius Caesar is going to be assassinated. If you remember the meme at the beginning of the slideshow from last week, on that slideshow, it started with this here, and it said, "I used to be the emperor, but then I took 23 steps to the body." It was, yeah, meme. I know, it's a bad meme. It's okay. But what does that mean? Well, senators are going to plot to kill Caesar because they fear him. They're worried he is destroying the republic as we know it. And senators involved eventually are going to be punished for their crime. What are they going to do? 23 senators are going to invite him to the Senate, make him think that they're about to have a really good discussion amongst 23, and they all pull out daggers and they murder him on the Senate floor. Yes. So those senators will eventually be punished. Some, I believed, stripped of their title of senator. I think some others were actually executed because they murdered the emperor of Rome. So Caesar ultimately is going to be seen in two major ways by Romans and histories too. First, he was someone who helped the poor. So on the bright side, on a good side, well, a lot of people viewed him, especially the poor of Rome, he was one of the few patricians who really wanted to help the poor. So much like that earlier civil war we just talked about, he was essentially fighting on the side of the poor, if you will. And others viewed him as a power-hungry tyrant because he named himself king. He made himself essentially an emperor of Rome. People hated that. Alright. That is the last thing I got here on notes for today. One last thing to complete is a very short Edpuzzle, actually. And this Edpuzzle is going to kind of look at this rise of Julius Caesar in Rome. And that's the last thing for today. So just some reminders as you get ready to move on to that. Don't forget to take a picture of your notes and turn that in on the assignment here at this video. And then complete the very short Edpuzzle. I think it was like a 4-minute video. Just complete that, and it's going to be a little recap of Julius Caesar and his rise to power. Tomorrow we're going to look at Octavian, who is the son of Julius Caesar. Why is he going to become to power? Well, Julius Caesar was just murdered. And Rome is not going to be very stable after Julius Caesar is murdered. So, I will catch you tomorrow with part 2 of this, and we'll have some fun next week making some presentations. All right, have a great Thursday.